Everyone, and welcome to today's presentation about cross-framework compliance and assessments. If you're watching, there's a little bit of assumption that you're here and you know somewhat about how to develop compliance programs, writing requirements, and writing tests. Also, there's a little bit of assumption that you understand the PCI customized approach for 4.0. Now, these videos are in the Global Content Library, and so if you're not familiar with the Customized Approach 4.0, I recommend you go to the Global Content Library and watch my video on the Customized Approach. Is it right for your company? And then come back and then watch this video. Now, I'm Ron Tosto with Survetus, cybersecurity by design consulting company, and we work with supporting PCI DSS and other frameworks. And first, I'd like to start with thanking the PCI Security Standards Council for the opportunity to share some thoughts on ways to use the PCI DSS 4.0 beyond the protection of cardholder data. Now, just some logistics. This is a recording, so we don't have an opportunity to Q&A. But if you have a question from this presentation, I would encourage you to reach out to me via LinkedIn, and then we will get back to you on any information you would like. Now, today we're going to really talk about four pieces. And the first piece is really getting from the objectives to the assessment and what is in the middle. Some of the known uses for the PCI DSS as a standard for non-cardholder data, how we go about matching the objectives, and then building requirements in the testing procedures. Now, for many years, companies have been struggling with multiple standards to get through regulations and laws. Now, some of these examples depends on if you're a public company, a private company, a company in the EU or in the United States. And so one of those is ISO 27001, another one is NIST 853. And so we really get to, no matter what the situation is, the goal is to use a common security practice between the frameworks to develop, implement, and test all the controls within your environment and for the particular scope. Now, in the past, the PCI Security Standards Council released mapping of controls from the NIST 853 to the PCI DSS. Now, this was a version before version 4 in 3.x and before, and this really followed what we know now as the defined approach. The other objectives are found in each of the frameworks outside of PCI DSS. And so now we have the ability to find a one-for-one match. Now, when we get from the objectives to assessments, we see really in the middle is the requirements and the testing procedures. And from the beginning, the PCI has provided a polished set of requirements and testing procedures to support the assessment. As changes occurred to the standard, it was addressed new and changing threats to the card data environment and the cardholder data. And while the community was not a part of, had not seen the objectives in the past version of the standards, objective has always been a part of developing the requirements from the PCI Security Standards Council. And with this a tremendous appreciation that we now actually have those objectives to use in other frameworks. So in the objectives of other frameworks, we now can take the time to match what we know. And for example, NIST 853 Control IA2 specifically talks about the use of identification and authentication prior to use of the control. And as you see here in the PCI Security Standards 8.3.1, we cannot access a system without identification, at least a single factor authentication to use the system. And so we really get these two objectives to match, and so that we can say, now that we have an objective that matches beyond the PCI data environment, we can use the 853 to follow a similar requirement and a test that matches what has already been published in the PCI DSS. And ultimately, we end up with a single approach to all systems within the environment, regardless if it's PCI DSS, 853, or any other framework. Now, there are some other standards that also have used PCI DSS to protect other information. And so we're just going to look at these three, and I want to do this so that we understand that While we are talking about protecting cardholder data in the card data environment for PCI DSS, there are some other uses. And so you see here EI3PA, which is the Experian third-party assessor assessment. There is SWIFT for wire transfers, the customer support program, and Adobe's common control framework. And so they've used the data security standards in 3 different ways. Experian said, let's use the entire PCI DSS. Let's go to the DSS, replace page 4 where it normally says, let's protect cardholder data, let's protect sensitive authentication data and track data, and then let's replace it with credit reporting information such as social security number and credit reports that go into determining if someone can get loans. In the case of SWIFT, SWIFT has only 32 objectives. And SWIFT very specifically said, we're going to take our 32 objectives and we're going to match it to the requirements of PCI DSS so that we can have a like and use a qualified security assessor to do assessments for security based on financial wire transfers. Now Adobe, they did something a little different, and they've done this several years ago when they started on a common control framework. Adobe, as a public company, has to follow SOX. They also are an international company that followed ISO 27001. And then, of course, because they take credit cards, we're following PCI DSS. Now, in this particular exercise, they had to take the objectives from the SOX, objectives from 27001, and the requirements, because this was pre-4.0, of PCI DSS, and then match them so they could come up with a single policy. And so now they have had the ability to protect their financial information based on a public company, prove their ability to overall protect private information under ISO, and protect cardholder data. And so these are just 3 great examples of how other organizations have been trying to use PCI DSS to protect a greater environment. But we've really seen now that with 4.0, if Adobe was to start over again with a common control framework, they would actually be able to compare objective to objective to objective. And then this is where we see where the step is when we match whatever your frameworks are, regardless if it's HIPAA, NIST 853, NIST Common Cybersecurity Framework, PCI, HIPAA, that you really overlay these 3 factors, and then you go through the process. Now, I recommend that you use an external agency to help you do an unbiased review of the objectives so that you really get down to what matches as an objective, and then really execute that so that we know what our objectives are. Now, once you have matched the objectives, this really gets into a decision process. And the decision process gets into the 3 steps. After we have identified the common controls, then can the control, and we say we want to develop a requirement. Now, if you can take the PCI DSS defined approach requirement as written and use it for a non-PCI DSS need, then you have already you already have the requirement for you. This saves you on a level of effort and in developing the requirement itself, and then also saves you a level of effort in creating the test. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Why do we have the customized approach? The customized approach for PCI DSS was really developed in a way to overcome new technologies that couldn't follow the defined approach. And I think a lot of organizations are going to see that exist as well for non-PCI DSS pieces. So finding the common objective may actually allow you to take the customized approach from your PCI DSS, use the targeted risk analysis, use the development of the requirement and the testing procedures, and use it in both your PCI and your non-PCI environments, while understanding the data that you may be protecting under another framework is not going to be your cardholder data or your CDE or card data environment, but is going to protect a particular piece of data that you need to understand. And so again, this gets into what is the maturity model of your company. And so if you think about your maturity model, if you have a mature compliance program and a mature security program, then customized approach may be the right direction to go. However, if you have a control, such as the example that we use for PCI DSS 8.3.1 and 853. And the defined approach will protect both the card data environment and a non-card data environment. Then use the defined approach and the defined testing period. And this way, you've saved yourself a lot of things. Now, what did we get out of this? What we get out of this is one simplified approach, less effort, and really probably the biggest one, which we all know exists for anybody that's done assessments, is reducing the fatigue that happens to your technical staff when they have to do 3 assessments or 4 assessments instead of a single requirement and a single test, which will be taken in multiple reports for whatever your frameworks are. Now, I'd like to just think about cross-framework matching is really best practice. And for the reason that I just said is reduce audit fatigue, simplify your processes, and protect multiple data approaches. Now, matching the objectives in the PCI DSS and other frameworks organization could rapidly develop the requirements and the testing procedures as the baseline. Use a simplified 3-step process to get from objectives to your requirements to your test so that you can ultimately get the assessment results that you need. And so this is a unique time for us. Use the new technologies, use the customized approach objectives, let the objectives drive the lower level requirements into something that really makes sense for your company, and then it's a win-win for all organizations. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.